Midland.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Midland Cultural Center, and welcome to A Day in the Life. Now, here is the host of A Day in the Life, Fred Hacker.
Well, good evening and welcome. We're delighted to see you. Thank you for coming to our program this evening. This is kind of a marker program. This is the 125th program in our series, and I think it sort of marks the end of our 10th season. So we want to thank the people who made that possible. First of all, our season sponsors, Bales, Dishaw, and Holloway. And I think we have a few folks from the firm with us this evening. Is Kathy Bales here? Yeah, Kathy's here. And Michelle's here. And Jeff's here. And Janet's here. So please stand up and accept our thank you. We are very appreciative of your continuing support. The firm is a financial services firm, advisory firm, part of RBC Dominion Securities. So we really treasure your continuing support. Thank you. And our sponsor for this evening's program is Alexandra McLaughlin. She has a company called Art by Alex, and she is, you might have guessed from that title, an artist. She has a lifelong connection to Georgian Bay. And Alex, I understand that you're now doing something called Come Paint With Me, excursions by boat combining your passions for art and for land stewardship. So, Alex McLaughlin, would you stand up and accept our thanks? Reluctant, aren't you? Well, we're grateful to you for sponsoring us. I now want to welcome our special guest this evening. I have known Doug slightly, and about Doug much more for many, many years, but it's been really fascinating for me to get to know him as we prepared for this evening. He's a guy with many talents, many interests, many achievements, but he's best known as an author and journalist. Would you please join with me in welcoming Douglas Hunter? Welcome. Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I have to make a preemptive comment.
Yeah, sure.
I have a lifelong affliction, Harry Neal, of the Hockey Night in Canada, called cranial vapor lock, which means I cannot recall names for the life of me.
Well, this is going to be a long night.
Yeah, if A.Y. Jackson was not written on my palm right now, I wouldn't remember what that book is about. So,
well,
it's a preemptive forgive me if I just completely.
Both fake it.
Yeah. It'll be a lot of John Doe's as we go through.
What's his name?
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's what my mother-in-law told me for about the first 25 years of my marriage. I'm used to what's his name. So, Douglas, I have to tell you that I've been an admirer of yours long before I knew you, although you did remind me that we met looking at boats or something together.
Looking at my very small boat from your very large boat.
Well, I was interested in your boat, obviously. Yeah. What we try and do with this program is look at some of the events that have shaped your life, some of the circumstances, some of the people, some of the experiences that have shaped your life. And we always begin where it began. So can you tell us where and when you were born?
Born in 1959 in Hamilton, Ontario.
And can you tell us a little about your parents, just a brief introduction to them?
My mom and dad were the basic middle class, working class, post-war couple. My dad was a machinist. He was a tool and die maker. Worked in industry in Hamilton, and then my mom had been a nurse, but when the kids showed up, she started taking care of us. And actually, my older sister had a variety of disabilities, so I think a lot of my mom's time was spent fighting with the school board over how she was being treated, and then dealing with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have siblings.
Yes. Yeah.
How many of them do you have?
I still have 3. I have 2 sisters and a brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there's so much I want to talk with you about that we're not going to spend a lot of time on the
Right.
early days.
Right.
But your elementary schooling, you were telling me there was an incident or an event that you felt had some impact on you. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think school came down to 2 important bookended things. One was skipping grade 3, which people don't do anymore for good reasons, because the moment you skip a grade, you're a year behind. You've left your cohort behind, the kids you were around on the street, and then you're with another bunch of kids that you don't know, and they're all a year older than you. They're always going to be a year older than you. And that's not to say I had a bad school experience. I think I had lots of friends and got through that fine. But I think that what was critical was the fact that the system still had grade 13. Because without grade 13, so I would have been, if this system, I would have been 17 going to university. And that was just way too fast, way too soon. So when I was in high school, because partly my dad was a machinist, I was doing like machine shop, electrical. I was doing all these. I never took a spare. I was doing all my university stream stuff, but I was always in the shop. So, and I think if I'd kept on that track, I probably would have ended up in engineering, which would not have been a bad thing. But the fact that I had grade 13, they gave you one more year to kind of think and prepare. That's when I loaded. I went back and started taking. I'd taken art, I think, twice in high school. Not really serious about it, but I took it in 13 and loaded up on some Englishes, and that completely changed where I went after that.
And where did you go after that?
So after that, I went to McMaster for art. I actually had applied and I was accepted at Sheridan College for animation. And at the time, I think the guy that ran the program did Yellow Submarine. He was the animator there.
Oh, yeah.
And so you take a portfolio in, and I was accepted, and I was brought in by a woman in the program, shown some student films. This is what we do, and that was the time, if you know National Film Board stuff, like the Big Snid and The Cat Came Back. It's all hand-drawn cell, no computers.
All pre-computer, yeah.
So you're working for 2+ years to produce 3 minutes of film, and what she said to me really stuck with me, which was, you better have a lot of patience. That you're going to be doing these little projects that take a really long time to finish. And not that I don't have patience, I've written 20-odd books,
I
but
was just going to say, your career is...
but you start to feel like, boy, that idea could get stale real fast. If it was just like 3 minutes of fun, and then, well, that's my next 2 years trying to draw all these silly cats. So I had also applied McMaster in the art program. It wasn't a BFA at the time. It was just, you did art, studio art, and art history in a combined bachelor's program.
Was there anybody at McMaster that had an influence on the direction you went with your life?
I don't know in the life. I mean, it was a good program. It was, some hardworking people. There were a few instructors. Lauren Taves in painting was good. John Meisnikowski was the sculptor instructor. I really didn't belong in sculpture. You had to take it, and he was a difficult guy. But for some reason, we got along just as people.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And following McMaster, I would have, had I not talked to you previously, said, tell us about your master's program. But there wasn't one.
No, it's the big dark secret of my PhD. There's no master's before.
I think that's fascinating. You have an undergraduate.
Yeah. Ordinary BA.
Yeah, a past BA, we used to call them at McMaster. Yeah.
Followed by a PhD.
Followed by a PhD.
And a postdoc.
Nice, and postdoc, yeah. Nice work if you can get it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out of chronological order for a moment, because I want to just stick with the education theme for a second. First of all, how did you end up later in life, and you can tell us or not how old you were when you did it, but how did you end up doing a PhD later in life?
I was in my late 40s, and I got creeped on Facebook by Samuel de Champlain. who turned out to be Carolyn Podrushny, the assistant associate, I don't know which one she was. She's a full professor now of history at York. But she was kind of hanging around, lurking on Facebook. I was on Facebook at the time, I'm not now. And I had written God's Mercies about Champlain and Henry Hudson, and published in 2007, and she'd read it. And so she kind of pretended to be Champlain and started poking me a bit with it, and then she decided I knew what I was talking about, and then revealed herself, and then asked me to come in and, I'll try to make this not too elaborate, but she asked me to come into a class, to a fourth year. She assigned the book to the class and wanted me to explain narrative nonfiction, how you go about researching and writing it as opposed to academic. And since I don't know anything about how you did academic, I could talk about narrative. So I did that, and then she took me to lunch and said, you should do a PhD. You know, I had just never in my life thought 30 years after escaping higher education that I would do that. So that's how I ended up going back in, because Carolyn talked me into it. And then it became an issue of, well, there's no master's, there's no honors BA, but by 2010 they would say, you know, I came in, you know, they looked at me and they said, bring some books, and I did, and they said, any of these is a major research paper.
Yeah.
You're totally wasting your time in a master's, we need to get you into a PhD. And so they did, and I had absolutely zero idea what I was getting into, because nobody in my cohort that I ever knew ever went on to a doctoral level. Nobody in my family, like before my siblings, had ever been to university, never mind. We were all like the first university college people. So I almost quit 3 weeks in because I just thought the reading lists are insane. I'm driving back and forth to York from here. And they said, no, you're doing fine, just keep it up. You know, you'll be okay, and it was okay.
Were you with any students your own age, or was your cohort?
No, I was the old cranky guy, you know. And I was warned by, because I had to have some letters of recommendation from a couple academic esteemed people to say, no, really, he'd be fine here, you can ignore the masters. And one of them did say to me, just keep your head down, don't make any waves, there are people that aren't going to be happy that you're there, a lot of it faculty because you're coming out of the trade thing. They were actually great. But you know, on the student side, I really did think, I'm just going to go in, I'm going to get my readings, I'm going to do my papers, I'm going to go home, and I don't have to deal with anybody. And I quickly learned you will not survive a doctoral program without working with your cohort. So I did. I met some great people, and I think, yeah, in your 50s when you start, they're not all kids. Some of them had never been anything but university, but others had gone and done other things, and they were in their late 20s, 30s, maybe somebody was 40. But, you know, it was a good group to be around, and I think it just kept me maybe a little lively. Your brain doesn't atrophy, and you have to listen to people with different ideas and
before you feel
challenged a bit.
old about having done that.
Yeah.
Let me explain to you that I was 17 years older than you.
Yes.
I went back and
Well, that's horrifying.
graduate studies. Yeah, yeah. Most of my cohort colleagues were, you know, younger than my children by far.
Right.
Closer in age to my grandchildren.
Right.
So tell us about your dissertation, and maybe a little more than just the title, because the title is almost unfathomable to me. So let's start with that.
Well, the title was Stone of Power, which I was told should be a Viking holding a sword and, you know, with a ripped shirt open or something. But when you go to do a doctoral program, you have to have a thesis idea. You go in with a project. So when I was recruited in, they just said, well, apart from these letters, give me a thesis. I was like, okay, and that was a late admission because of a lot of other things. So I thought, well, you know, being out of the trade side, one of the things that's always been interesting or come around a lot with me is pseudo-history, which is the area of kind of the fringe, the weird, the misinterpretation. At the most extreme, it's the Eric von Daniken Chariots of the Gods stuff and ancient astronauts. But there's a tremendous amount of misinterpretation of historical material out there. And a lot of it is indigenous material. A lot of it is rock art and things like that. People will look at it and go, oh no, these are Bronze Age, people from Ireland, you know, Indians don't do these things kind of stuff. So I had that as my initial focus, and remarkably, I think what I sketched out stayed pretty close to what I did. And I looked at a lot of samples, and I ended up using a rock called Dighton Rock in New England, which in the 19th century was the best known archaeological relic in North America, and it's now virtually nobody knows anything about it. But what was interesting about Dighton Rock is since it was first noticed in 1680, people are just coming up with all kinds of ideas as to who made the carvings on the rock. And it was never the native people. It was Egyptians, it was Atlantis, it was the lost Portuguese explorer Corte Real, it was Vikings, in Vinland. And every one of them was just as certain as the last ones were. And these weren't fringe people. These were like scholarly types. And so for all of them, to give it to the white guys, you had to explain away why the native people would do it. So by about the 1700s, they'd come up with what I call the too lazy and stupid theory. That just Indians wouldn't do these things. They didn't have the tools, they didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the inclination. So the other thing that was interesting to me was it really was an interesting proxy way to say, if you look at how these people interpreted the rock over time, you got a very good idea of how the dominant colonizing society conceptualized native people, because they had to put them in a particular box. So it's constant through these 350 years. So that was published by University of North Carolina Press, which is a great academic house for American colonialism and indigenous history, and it's just come out in paperback actually. So, and I changed the title to The Place of Stone, which is a little more resonant and gets away from the Vikings waving swords in the air with lightning bolts that people thought it should be about. So that's.
So, you haven't mentioned it, but I will. You received the 2012 Vanier Graduate Scholarship from the federal government in Canada, which was really a significant part of your ability to be able to continue with those studies because it pays.
Yeah, it plays good coin.
Yeah.
And then there was the Taylor Fellowship. There's a couple Vaniers and there's one Taylor Fellowship. It's whoever's the top Vanier gets the Taylor. So I ended up with the Taylor, which provided transportation stuff. And what it was, the way it's structured, the Vanier, is they pay you for 3 years to do nothing but be a scholar. You aren't even allowed to be a teaching assistant. And the biggest challenge for people in PhDs, I would say, a quarter of the people I went to school with actually defended their dissertations in the end.
Sure.
It's not because they're stupid. It's because after 5 years, if you don't have funding and you've never done a project of that length, how do you complete it? And people just don't. So it was, even though I'd been through book projects before and I wasn't terrified by the research and the writing, still for the government to just say, or it's Social Science and Humanities Research Council, sure, say here's a pile of money every year. This is all we're paying you to do. Go do it. And my joke to my supervisor, Samuel de Champlain, was the scholarship runs out on April 30th, 2015, and I'm defending at 2 o'clock that afternoon. And it's a 3-hour session, and I'm walking out at 5 because the money's done, and then I'm gonna go work. As it turned out, I ended up getting a postdoc after that, and I defended on April 4th, or 6th.
Good for you.
6th, yeah, I think.
Yeah.
But it worked out for me.
You also received a dissertation prize from the university.
And
then the Distinguished Dissertation Award for Humanities, Social Sciences, and Fine Arts from the Canadian Association of Graduate Studies. So
it went okay.
You're well decorated. Yeah, good stuff.
And I was so naive, I didn't even know what SSHRC was. I mean, really, I can remember an early meeting with when she's explaining all the funding stuff, and she said this weird slurry acronym, and I'm sitting with my other two, people she was supervising. And I was like, what's SSHRC? And Karen looked at me and I was like, oh, we got a live one here. He has no idea how this system works.
Yeah. That's great. Now, you mentioned postdoc studies. Explain, maybe some folks don't understand.
I didn't understand it. I applied for it. There was a research project, but really, to be honest, I was at University of Waterloo. I was never there. They had no room for me. They had nothing for me to teach. And my supervisor, who supported it, said, your job is to get your dissertation published. That's what you need to be doing for the next 2 years. See you later.
Wow.
And I don't think I was on campus more than once or twice after that.
You did deliver a paper at the university.
Yeah, I delivered at Laurier. For some reason, anthropology, well, maybe because of a lot of the theory stuff I did around indigenous identity and things, but anthropologists for some reason really liked me. So, yeah, I did a thing at Laurier more than once. I had nothing to do with Laurier, but they heard of me and said, can you come in and do these things? So, yeah.
Now, to say that your employment history has been varied,
Checkered.
would be an understatement. Can you chronologically walk us through
Hell no.
from postdoc to when you decided you were an author?
From postdoc?
Yeah.
Well, that was,
Well, no, I'm sorry, from graduation.
yeah, McMaster.
McMaster, yeah.
Well, before I got to McMaster, I was starting to work to do cartoons. So I had sent some cartoons to a little magazine called Gam on boating, because I was a sailor. So they published them and offered me a summer job and a job over the winter holidays kind of thing. It was a little magazine where you did absolutely everything. And by everything, I mean even go sit in people's offices when they hadn't paid their bills, on their advertising. The publisher would send me out to like basically camp there until a check showed up. So it was a great education in how you run a magazine. And then I was in a 4-year program at McMaster, and I just decided I wasn't going to do independent study. Most of my colleagues were going to be, not that there's anything wrong with it, but they were going to be high school art teachers, and I didn't see myself going that way, so I just chucked some credits, cut it to a pass BA, and I had a 3-day-a-week job waiting for me at this little magazine. So I went there and I wrote my first book then, against the odds, on a radical racing yacht called Evergreen. Just how I met Steve Killing, because he was on the design team and he was on the bow. And then I did a book on the America's Cup in '84 with now a good friend, Jeff Boyd. He was the tactician on the Canadian boat. And then between that, I worked at GAM for a couple of years, and then I was offered a job at Canadian Yachting, which Clayton Hunter owned. I went there as a technical editor, did that for a couple of years. Then I was offered a position as a financial reporter, a reporter at the Financial Post, because the news editor there had been reading the stuff I did on business, in the boating business, and said, you should be here. So I went over there, I did my Canadian securities course to kind of beef up what I understood, did the 6-month course, and then there was a shake-up at Canadian Yachting, and 9 months later, they offered me the editorship. I went back and I did that for 4 years. So, and then there was a 2-year, really my window's open at home. We're going to ignore that.
Could somebody just run down and close the window?
There's footsteps on the roof. I hear helicopters. Yeah, and I did a city magazine in Hamilton for 2 years, and then in '93 I went completely freelance. I took you step off the balcony and you wave your arms really hard and fast, and you made the right decision.
Well, I think it's been the right decision. Certainly you've been very successful at it. I'd like to talk about some of the books that you've written.
Right.
And you've written a lot, so this list may not be exhaustive, but it's what I was able to find in my research. And what I'd like to ask you is whether you could give us kind of a 2-sentence précis of each book, just in case.
I can remember what they were.
Yeah, well, if you can't, I've got notes. So let's talk about Open Ice.
Open Ice was the book I wrote. There's a little bit more parallel. When I left to go freelance, I signed with Penguin Books. I actually wanted to. Growing up in Hamilton, you point a car down the road, you had a donut shop.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in the business story, but the editor there said, "No, you really got a good sports biography here. You need to do both." So I did, and that started me down the road of doing about a half a dozen hockey books. I'd never written a sentence about it in my life. Played a bit as a kid. Watched it, but that was the start of that phase of book writing, really, from '94.
Well, let's stay with the theme of business books for a
yeah.
minute then, and tell us about. We seem to.
Well, that's the business of getting a mutiny.
Yeah, tell us about Glory Barons.
Glory Barons was one of a series of hockey books I did. Penguin just started commissioning books from me, one after the other. And I had no right writing it because I'd never been to Edmonton, but they wanted it. And what I did is I turned it into an opportunity to write a book, really a proxy. It was like a study of small market franchise problems in the NHL, looking at, because they were at the time almost leaving for various places in the States. So it was interesting in its own way to do.
Yeah. And they're doing well this year.
They're doing well.
Yeah, sort of. Until last night. Yeah. Molson, 2001, you wrote a book about the Molson Empire.
I wrote a book about John Molson. That was the first big departure I think I made after this series of hockey books. Because again, I think Penguin wanted the book, and I went in and looked at the Molson papers at the National Library, Library and Archives Canada, and was astonished by the richness and the material for this 18-year-old coming from England in 1782 in the middle of the Revolutionary War on gets picked up by a British warship because his ship is sinking on the way, and he ends up in the brewery business. So the book is really about that first generation of Molson establishing the business.
And The Bubble and the Bear was the year after that.
The Bubble and the Bear, that was another Doubleday, came to me and said, we want a book about Nortel. People lost all their money. And that was literally the pitch. And nobody's going to want to talk about that.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to want to read it. So it was a book about a irrational exuberance of the market and the meltdown of the economy. And I did spend a lot of time, way more time than I wanted to, learning how, taxes and things worked it's just it was the whole atmosphere of complete denial. And my thesis was that even though people like to think about there's nefarious things going on, it was really the period I was talking to until the point of the meltdown. If you actually read the financial statements on their own merits, you could see this train wreck coming, and nobody wanted to listen to the message that it was going to go off the rails, which wasn't popular with people. It won the National Business Book Award, but I don't think it was what people wanted to hear.
And then you went back to Tim's for a double-double.
I went back, it took me, how many years? That book came out in 2012?
2012.
I just always wanted to go back and do the rest of the business story. It seemed to just take me a long time to talk a publisher into wanting to do it. And so, of course, by the time I talked them into it, I was in the middle of a PhD program. So I had to kind of delay my comprehensive exams for a year. It was completely insane. I did that on top of everything else. And then I did double-double that was a finalist for the awards, but
Yeah.
I lost to the current Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm never forgiving her. I had lunch with her, she was lovely.
Although,
Yeah,
she should have finished second, right?
yeah, really.
Yeah, really. So let's shift our focus for a minute to the history books.
Right.
And we are leading up to
Right.
this recent history book, of course.
Right.
But I think we've got a picture here from God's Mercies, 2006.
No, this is actually, what is it from? It is from God's Mercies.
Thank you.
And actually, why this exists is this is actually part of my graphic work, because I made this. And the reason I made it is because my publisher couldn't figure out what the cover was going to be
Oh, okay.
for the catalog, and they came to me and said, what do you got? And I don't design my own covers, but this ended up being promotional artwork we used in various ways.
Yeah.
So this is Henry Hudson having a very bad day in James Bay. He's over in the little boat way in the back, kind of never to be seen again. So that's what that's from.
And it did well. It was a finalist for the Writers' Trust nonfiction
Yeah, and the Governor General.
and the Governor General's
Yeah.
literary.
Didn't win either of them, but I'm not bitter.
Half Moon, 2009.
That came right out of that because it was Henry Hudson. And I literally said, 2009, boy, that's 300 years, no, 400 years since he came up the Hudson River. Somebody in New York's going to want to publish something like this. And so I did the book for Bloomsbury Press in New York, and it was great fun. I really enjoyed that book.
And that was followed by The Race for the New World, Christopher Columbus, John Cabot, and Lost History of Discovery.
Yeah, that came out. I finished it just as I was going to start my doctoral program. So I had to do my copy edit while I was in my coursework. And that came out with Paul Gray Macmillan in New York, and then there was a Canadian edition done by Douglas and McIntyre. I can't believe I'm remembering all these names.
And you're doing very well. Yeah, there hasn't been a John Doe yet.
Perrier.
I have to tell you, and our friends in the audience, that when I was writing out my notes, Spellcheck took the title of your book, The Race for the New World, and corrected it for me. They
Right.
changed it to The Race for North America.
And I don't doubt it did that. And actually, as a very quick aside, it's one of those lessons where people, authors don't have contractual right over their titles. It's always a knife fight in a closet to get the title you want.
Yeah.
And so I'm always very pleased when I get them. Like Jackson Ward, I got it.
Yeah.
Breedmore, I got it. This title was, I can't remember what my title was, but that was Paul Gray Macmillan's title. And I had a real struggle with it. And I said, well, it wasn't really a race for the New World because they didn't know the New World was there.
Yeah.
And then you get reviews that kind of smack you around a bit saying, oh, there's no race for the New World. What's this man talking about? It's not in the book.
You say, not me,
Yeah.
not me.
Just bam, bam.
Well, you mentioned Beardmore.
Yeah.
Tell us what it's about.
Beardmore is about a hoax about a Viking grave that never was in northern Ontario, so-called discovered, and was taken in by the collection was put on display by the Royal Ontario Museum in 1938, and then there was just 18 years of protracted, fairly vicious at times defense of the acquisition, and the whole hoax fell apart in the 1950s, but for about 20 years it just completely rewrote
Wow,
the history books as to where Vikings came.
interesting.
Yeah.
1996, you wrote something called War Games.
Something, yeah. Yeah, War Games was an interesting book without a thesis. It was simply the convergence of sport, politics, and combat in Canada in the Second World War. So it was Conn Smythe, it was the conscription crisis, it was Maurice Richard going for his 50-50. One of my great treasures is I actually got to interview Maurice Richard.
Oh, wow.
3 months to get him to agree to answer 10 questions. He was a lovely man, but yeah, that's what that book was about.
And then most recently, The Place of Stone that we just spoke about. This is the cover of that book, and this was your doctoral thesis as expanded.
Yeah, expanded, revised, did a little more work. Even though, the dissertation was, I thought, pretty readable, I was fortunate. UNC Press is a great press with a great editor, Mark Simpson-Voss, and he wanted this book, but he also said, I know you need to write a book. I know you've done a dissertation, but I want you to have the time to do what you want with this. So it was tightened up a little bit, and some of the structure of the, bit of the academic structure was gotten rid of. But they were really committed to publishing good academic books that were actually readable. And the toot my horn moment on this book is that it's the only book I've ever written that got a starred reviewed in Publishers Weekly in the US, which is the big trade public academic press. And it just showed that you can do pretty good work with these places with the right people.
That's great.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Let's shift our attention for a moment to boating. And we're going back a bit chronologically now. But you mentioned this briefly against the odds.
Yeah, that was my first book. And it was just a great exercise in interviewing a lot of people, and I had access to some of the documents involved on the Canadian side. So it was a good lesson in the value of having decent resources to do a project. But it sort of started me going, I had no idea how hard it was to publish a book. Personal Library was the first publisher I went to. They had published a book on windsurfing. They'd actually won the Governor General's Award. And so I knew Jeffrey Simpson's book, but I went in, I told some stories, they handed me a contract, and off I went and wrote a book. I thought, oh, this is easy. What's so hard about doing books? It kind of sank in much later how hard it is to do books.
And then there was Trials 3 years later.
Yeah, that was about the America's Cup in 1983 with the Canada One Challenge. I teamed up with Jeff Boyd, who was the tactician. Well, actually, Jeff I just saw a week ago in Kingston. I've stayed in touch over the years with him. That was just taking you through, the Canadian program. Again, local guy, Steve Killing, happened to be one of the designers, and kind of extended our knowledge of each other at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in Ultimate Sailing, you did the text.
Yeah, Ultimate Sailing, I did the text for Sharon
Sorry,
Green,
that's
the book.
not it.
Yeah, but that's,
Yeah, so Sharon Green did the photography for all.
yeah, she actually was Don Green's daughter from Evergreen, and became a really major professional photographer, marine photographer.
Right.
So when she went to do a book, she hired me to do all the copy for it. Yeah.
And that brings us to yacht design. And I saw Steve Killing in the audience here. He was your co-author.
Yeah, I talked Steve into doing this. I don't know why he agreed. We just wrote the book together. We did the illustrations together. I did the page design. It was with W.W. Norton in New York, and we worked on it off and on for about 3 years, and published it in *98.
Now, how come Steve's name's in bigger font?
He got more money than I did.
Oh. Now, in addition to being a journalist, an author, you have some other interests, and I've just put together an eclectic collection of some of the things you've done. So tell us about the background to this cartoon?
Well, this was
I
the
think
start.
it's-
This was the start of my cartooning. I must have been 17 when I did this. I dug these out of my banker's boxes. This is what got me a job at GAM. And actually, I was looking at them the other day, and I thought these aren't very funny. But I found one that was kind of okay. But this was sort of the start. This is literally how I got into publishing. I did cartoons, and got my
Yeah,
foot in the door.
I don't know whether everybody can read maybe you could read the
It just
caption.
says, the skipper saying, quick, what did it say? What's cheaper to collide with, a 32-foot cabin cruiser or a sailing school? That was a knee slapper of a one.
Still laughing.
Yeah.
This is a cartoon strip.
Yeah, when I went to McMaster, I started working as a cartoonist for the Silhouette, the student newspaper.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten I even did a cartoon called Steve, but I did. And so I was their editorial cartoonist. I did these strips. I did one called David and Harold for my last 2 years. And when I looked this up, it's funny, I realized this is the third week of September in my freshman year. What was I thinking? Like, I'm 18, I just started art school. I must have seen the first edition of the paper,
Yeah.
walked in somewhere in the middle of the second edition of the weekly with something, and they just started giving me space. And it was a really good newspaper. A lot of the editors went on to actually be editors at Southern newspapers and stuff.
Mhm.
It was a good student paper, really well run. So I just became their cartoonist.
I have to tell you, when I was at McMaster as an undergraduate, I don't think 18-year-olds in the third week of their first year
Yeah.
got into the Silhouette office, let alone were published, so good for you.
Yeah.
You have designed and illustrated 3 of your own books. We have an example here from the
It's Steve.
sailing book.
Yeah.
So in addition to being a journalist and
Yeah.
an author and
Yeah.
a graphic designer and a cartoon writer, you're also an illustrator.
Yeah, I think when I went freelance in '93, like page design stuff had started to come onto desks of editors, so you were getting some experience with things like Quark Express. So it was actually because of Penguin, after I did Open Ice, I think it was my idea that we should do a book on the history of goaltending, and they said, because my editor knew I'd been doing these other things, they said, well, could you actually package it? And like an idiot, you go, sure I could. And you've never worked in Quark in your life, really, outside of a magazine job. And like Illustrator, I've never worked in Adobe Illustrator. Guess I could buy a copy. Photoshop, never seen it. I think I'll go get one. Never took a course, just get the manual. I mean, there's this great scene in The Commitments, the movie, where their drummer quits. And so the roadie gets in and he thrashes around for a while and he's like, I think I got the hang of this now. And that's exactly what the work was.
How hard should it be?
How hard it be? Just give me some software. I'll figure this out. So I did that, and then there was another book called Champions where I did the same thing. I packaged the whole book, and then this was the third that Steve and I did.
And you also were the designer for a book called Wild Places, Wild Hearts?
Yeah, Gord Smitilo, an artist, commissioned a book to go with a national tour he was doing. And it was a great project.
It won a prize.
Yes, it was best travel thing at the Banff Festival. I didn't get a prize, but it was. And Alan, actually, such a good writer. He was actually a Governor General's finalist recently. So, fun project.
Great. And you also do cartography.
Yeah, that's a map from Half Moon. So, yeah, I started doing maps for my own book, because when you're doing books of exploration, everybody wants to look at a map. And probably now I've really kind of phased out a lot of the illustration work, because it's just hard to be all these different hats. And the last few things I was really doing all the time were maps. Publishers that knew me would, sometimes it was Bloomsbury in New York, would come and say, can you do a map of Latvia in 1940? And of course you could. So I would do that. And I always would do one for my own books in the frontispiece. But
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to all those other things, you're a landscape artist.
I went back to it in 2018. I had just, ironically, it was when I was starting to work on Jackson. Although the important point of that is that it's absolutely nothing like what AY Jackson does. I know the window's open.
The door now.
I want to know about it. I wanted to work in black and white, and I wanted to do landscape. I kind of got into this widescreen look of things, and I like black and white because it forces you to make a decision right away about how you're interpreting things. You don't have any colors to work with. So how do I make this, this 4-color scene work in gray, basically? And it was always drawing. So for whatever reason, about August 2018, I am really getting upset with this. I just like 3 or 4 months, I just did nothing but drove around looking for places. And the surprising thing to me was when you live here is that you think your response is going to be, oh, Georgian Bay, windswept pines. No, it was like the marshes and the farmland that I found more interesting. So I haven't had the time I really would like to. Like Jackson chewed up a lot of my day, and I'm trying to get back to it right now.
I'm going to show some examples,
All right.
but I have to share with you
Yeah.
a thought that just went through my mind in aid of nothing. But as you're playing with your watch there, I'm thinking of the day we had Brian Mulrooney as
Yes.
a guest in the show, and his iPhone or whatever
Yeah.
it was kept ringing.
Right.
And he finally took it. He had no idea how to turn it off. He took it out of his pocket and he threw it to one of his aides in the first row. And I just had this mental image of you throwing your watch into the
My
crowd.
wife is there somewhere. I can just whip it at her. My phone is off. I don't know why it's doing this.
Let's go back to the landscape because may I show a couple of examples?
Yeah.
Maybe you could describe this to us.
That's Cormorant Monument Channel. Those are the only drawing I did last year. It's up based on some photos and observations I did up in Monument Channel. And I actually wrote about cormorants on Nature magazine a few years ago because they're kind of a maligned bird that everybody hates.
Yeah.
So I kind of like them because people hate them so much. And so I hope people are kind of torn about, oh, it's kind of nice, but I hate those birds.
Tell us about this one.
Osprey, I like drawing sticks. You can tell that.
Yeah.
That's an osprey nest up on Rama Road. My daughter has that in her apartment. That's way too much attention to detail in Wichita Bay, the marshlands.
Is that another osprey?
Yeah, there's a
standing
platform
back?
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's Quarry Road. This rickety old shack. In the snow. Just driving down Quarry one day and went, stop. Need to do this.
It's excellent work.
Yeah.
It's really well done.
Thank you.
Now, just to wrap up, in part,
Right.
your multifaceted talent bank, you're also a contract researcher and a writer and a book doctor.
Yeah, the book doctor stuff is sort of helping people shape things up as to what they want it to be. I don't do as much of that as I used to. The contract writing is being brought in to either work as a ghost, be somebody, write it for them, or really more often now it's an institution of some kind, or there's a committee or something that needs a book done, but they really want me to do it, like me as in my name, the author, give you the support. It's not done in a traditional trade way. It's going to be packaged by a packager or whatever, but it's not vanity publishing. And it needs professional work, and they will pay to have decent work done. So I've done a couple of those. The only real ghosty thing I've done recently was Fred Eaton's memoir of Eaton's fame. And Fred was a delight to work with. He was nearing the end of his life, and he wanted the story told. He had a few strokes. He was all there, and he worked on it really diligently. We did a lot of interviews, and he would very carefully go over the drafts and mark things up. I mean, there's books out there written by hockey players that the hockey players never even opened and looked at it. They're $30 hockey cards, basically.
Yeah.
They get signed, but that kind of work's pretty rewarding.
We did have a guest on this program who does write his own stuff and who's a really good author, Ken Dryden.
Oh yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah.
I wrote about him. I interviewed his brother Dave.
Yeah.
Never get Ken to sit down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you'd enjoy him.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's a couple of people here who'd like to talk about Jackson's Wars. We do
Okay.
that?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can do that.
So let's begin with the cover of the book. And
It's not my cover.
you didn't draw that?
No. It's an interesting lesson in covers because I got my title, I got my subtitle, and then the art people came and showed me this cover, and I thought, boy, I wouldn't put Screen Road in the top 5 of his war paintings. It wouldn't have been the one I picked.
Yeah.
But then I sort of had this shut up and sit down before you hurt yourself,
Yeah.
and let the professional, like, even though I do their work, just let them do it. And people just love this painting. They really love this very unusual, very impressionistic scene that he
Yeah.
did. So I stopped
Yeah.
complaining about
There's a
the art.
lot going on
Yeah,
in
yeah,
that
Yeah.
picture.
yeah.
Well, I probably don't need to ask this question, but for the benefit of those here or watching us on television later,
Right.
who was A.Y. Jackson?
A.Y. Jackson was probably the leading, well, he was one of the leading figures in what became the Group of Seven. If anybody knows anything about Canadian art, they'll go, oh, Group of Seven, those guys. And it was a guys thing. So Jackson, this is Jackson in the First World War when he enlisted in June 1915 in Montreal. He was a Montreal artist, born in 1882. He really had more experience and training than anyone else in the group. He'd been to Europe, he'd been to school in Paris, he'd been in school in Chicago. You know, really by 1910, he was a painter's painter. He was a very good, strong, impressionistic naturalist. He was really there. So, you know, by the time the group is formed in 1920, he's almost 38 years old. So he has a whole, and I really still feel his best work is probably 1910 to about maybe 1922, the very earliest years of the group. So
I
that's
wonder
what
if
it
we
was.
might show 3 or 4 pieces.
Sure.
And they are, with one exception, from that era.
Yeah.
This is one that relates to our local area here.
Yeah, this is called Night Georgian Bay. It was painted in 1913. And the first title was Land of the Leaning Pine.
Yeah.
And his friend, one of his friends, Randolph Houghton, wrote him and said the title sent him to bed for a week, and then he changed it to Night Georgian Bay. But it's painted up at around Maxwell's Island up in the Cognition.
Yeah.
Because Jackson started coming here in 1910. It was his first experience of anything north in Ontario.
Now, a little different subject matter here.
Yeah, this is one of his paintings from his war period. After he was wounded in 1916, he sort of knocked around. He plainly had shell shock. He knocked around camps for almost a year. And then Lord Beaverbrook's Canadian War Art Memorials program was formed, and he was recruited to be one of the painters. So he was sent off to Passchendaele in the fall of 1917. And this is loosely based, supposedly on a sketch. He did it in 1918, but this really quite effectively describes the landscape in and around the Ypres salient that he was wounded at in June 1916.
And I'm going to ask our audience to keep this picture in mind because we'll come back and use it to talk about his technique in portraying the landscape rather than the actual battles.
Right.
What about this one?
This is March Storm, Georgian Bay. This was painted up on the Cognition. He went up to Freddie Channel in the spring of 1920 to get ready for the first Group of Seven show, and he cranked out paintings, and this was one of them. One of his best, I think, landscapes he did.
Interesting sky.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Just snow squalls. Yeah.
Now, tell us the era that you covered in the book and why.
Well, the era from Jackson's point of view is really the first major part of his life. One of the tricks you have when you do biography, and I've done enough biography, is that you're supposed to do the whole life. And lives are very complicated. And if you maybe, like, I get this done in 300 pages or whatever, you're going to compress a lot of things. You've got to skip a lot of things. And Jackson himself, in his own biography, he gets to the point of the founding of the Group of Seven in like 56 pages. He just rockets through the first part of his career. And really, his formation as an artist and the process starting around 1912 of when the people that become the group, plus Tom Thompson, start to meet and work with each other, and then that war period as a formation is really the most interesting, by far the most interesting part of his life. And it has a really great window into what becomes the modern in Canada in art.
In the introduction to the book, you quote Jackson by saying, "My life divides from before and after the war, just like BC and AD." As you examined his work, did you see that divide?
Yeah, it was a little more complicated than that because it wasn't just a hard line. I mean, the war is really August 1914. when he's in BC and he finds out there's a war on, up to his end of his service in April 1919. So there's almost 5 years in there where he's in a war in some way, either trying to deal with why am I not out there fighting, to signing up, to actually fighting, to then being wounded, then becoming an artist and changing completely that experience of the war. So it's an interesting trench in which a lot of things happen in his life. And it's a very transformative period for him. He really does become a better painter. And I think he becomes a better person. He goes through horrendous personal trauma, but he comes out of it, in many ways, he's frailer, he's a little weaker, but he's also much more sensitive about other people. Frankly, some of the racism that you would find in his early letters and comments fall by the wayside. He was a very angry, dangerous man by the spring of 1916 in combat, and he came out of it a different person.
Douglas, in the book, you question the treatment by some authors of the early days of an artist's career. And you say, we speed through the early parts of artists' careers at our peril, missing the crucial moments of professional and personal development. You observe that many of the treatments of A.Y. Jackson, including his own, minimize the pre-war period.
Right.
Do you find that in other writings, or is this just...
Well, I think it's because we made kind of a cult of the Group of Seven, which is 1920.
Yeah.
Like, that's when everything starts to matter. And there's kind of the group itself almost promoted it a bit too, is that, well, before that everything was boring and academic, and that's not really true. There were some very interesting painters working alongside, those people, in the 1910, 1912 period. But it's to break away from that idea that nothing's important until the group shows up, because the people themselves in the group were doing really interesting stuff 8-10 years before the group came along. I mean, it kind of, everything that was controversial or whatever had kind of been sorted out before the first shots were fired in the war. And then it was a matter of the movement surviving. Tom Thompson didn't survive the war because he drowned in a canoe. But, I mean, it was a near-run thing. I mean, Lismer avoided being blown to smithereens in the Halifax munitions explosion because he was teaching art there. J.H. MacDonald had a stroke. I mean, he was seriously ill. Lauren Harris had a complete nervous breakdown when his brother was killed in action in early 1918. So, and Jackson came very close to being killed in Sanctuary Wood in 1916. He had 2 serious shrapnel wounds. So that whole movement almost didn't happen. But what they had done up to that point is really important to understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why did you write this book?
Why did I write the book? The really superficial answer is that I was having lunch with somebody I knew in publishing and known for years. We were just getting caught up, and he had happened to have just gone to the McMichael. This was in 2017, and he had seen some of Jackson's war art, and he literally just said to me, "A.Y. Jackson, war, maybe something's there. You should look into that." And you kind of, okay, put that in a file. And I'm constantly looking things up and then getting excited, and by lunch I've thrown it away and I move on to something else. But, it kind of did stick with me. I looked around as to what was done, and then I went to the Library and Archives in Ottawa in the spring of 2018 to look at, okay, what are the materials? Just starting with the Jackson family, because a lot of stuff had been restricted access, but it recently just started coming out. And the moment I got into the materials, the boxes and boxes and the letters, that's when you realize that there's more than enough here for narrative. There's a story here that I can work with. You need the raw material. I don't want to work from secondary, what somebody else has written. I want to get to the primary stuff.
That's an interesting comment, if we can just pursue that.
Yeah.
Essentially what you're saying is you want to see the original letters, you want to hear about the original conversations, not read somebody else's interpretation of that.
No, absolutely not. I mean, you'd want to see it if you do your work properly. You'd want to see it anyway, just to make sure they quoted it properly. But people quote things, they'll take a sentence out of a letter.
Yeah.
I don't want to see the sentence. I want to see the 4 pages.
Yeah.
I want to see what else is there.
Yeah.
Because everybody interprets the past in a different way.
Douglas, I'd like to use this book as an example or a template for how somebody goes about writing a book, if you'll indulge me with that.
Right.
So, in general terms, now you told us how you came to write this book,
Right.
but in general terms, how do you choose a topic?
Well, the sausage making machinery is there's two directions, which maybe has come out a little bit. And as a professional, I either think of them myself, or a publisher brings me the idea, and then you have to decide if it's the publisher end. It's like, well, what can I do with this? Is there something there? Most of the time there is, but you have to assure yourself, because your name's going on it, that yeah, there's material here to work with. And also, I have to come up with a better concept or a broader concept.
Right.
Otherwise, you start with what are you going to talk about? What's here to do? What hasn't been done before? What is it? What is it you can bring it to? And the paradox of that is that it's always the most interesting and fun when you really have no idea where you're going. You just know that people haven't been down that trail yet, so you want to start going down it and learning things, and you don't have preconceived notions of where you're going to end up. And that's hard to get publishers to buy into. I mean, it takes a lot of bravery to say, in terms of like a contract in advance, saying, oh yeah, we'll let him do that, and we really don't know where he's going. But he'll come out the other end somewhere, it'll be fine. And, really in trade publishing, it's become harder and harder and harder to have that kind of editor relationship and confidence. Everything is driven by, I need the outline, I need exactly what you're going to do, and well, how do you say, I don't know what I'm going to exactly have. So my standard joke about outlines is an outline is something you write so you can throw it away and write the next outline. Yeah. And you just keep chucking them because you're just going to keep changing how much weight you give to different things. But the bottom line starts with, I have the confidence there's enough material, whether that's interviews with living people or whether there's archival. The best example I always give of that archival is that after I did those exploration books, William Baffin did 3 at least extraordinary voyages into Arctic Canada. He would be a brilliant subject. We know nothing, and I mean almost nothing about William Baffin. There is no there. So you could say, well, a William Baffin book would be great. We got 3 voyages. Well, no, you can't. There's no book. There's no story. Other people, yeah, there's tons of material, and there's stuff to be done. So that's kind of a long
story. So with
start.
Jackson's War, you decide you're going to do this.
Yeah.
Where do you begin your research? What's sort of the first question you want to answer?
You look for the biggest piles of stuff, and you're rooting them, and then you go to the next pile of stuff, and you're rooting those ones, and you try to avoid the cold sweat wake up in the night of, oh my God, I'm going to miss some major collection somewhere that I forgot to look in. Like when you send me a letter right before I've got this letter from March 20th. Have you ever seen it? I'm like, oh my God, I don't know. And it was March 26th, and I knew what the letter was. So anyway, this is the worst time when you publish a book. It's like you're just waiting after 4 years for someone to come out of the woods and say, did you ever look at the Johnson Smith Jones collection? Font 37, there's an interesting letter. Oh, no, I didn't know anything about it.
Now, something I'm intrigued by is you're rooting through all this stuff, as you say.
Yeah.
How do you compile what you're going to use?
Phone camera.
Okay.
Just sit there and take pictures. Yeah. I just make digital files of everything there, and then I take it all home and I open it on my computer and I start, I organize it and, start working with it.
Yeah. Did you ever run into a dead end in research?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, all the time. There's lots of unanswerable questions. A great example with Jackson is we have all these letters from Jackson to his cousin Florence Clement. Right. He was obviously completely over the top, smitten with her. We have none of the letters from Florence to him. Those were all destroyed. So we have this one-sided conversation. Yeah. We have all these letters from Jackson to his mother. We have nothing from Jackson's mother to him. So you're often just hearing half of the exchange, and you're really wondering, you're trying to feel your way through as to what was really going on here. I have what Jackson said, but I don't know. What did she feel about him?
Mm-hmm.
Why was she frustrated by this behavior of his, or you don't know? So there's some dead ends that are just going to remain dead forever.
When you write a book like this, do you have a thesis in mind at the beginning? Is there a point you've decided you're going to make, or does that grow out of the research?
I think a lot of other points grow out as you work through it. I think actually the idea of Jackson's wars, plural, was pretty firm in my head very early on. It's the title is there for a reason. It wasn't just the.
I'm going to ask you about that.
Yeah, you can ask me about that, but that was early on. I could see that.
Yeah.
So a lot of other things about the nature of how he painted the war landscapes, what he was going through, A lot of that other stuff, you're working your way through as you're seeing the materials and thinking about it.
Could you have written this book if you didn't have an arts background?
I think in some ways, no, just because, not because I'm a great artist or anything, it's just because there was something actually appealing about reading about somebody going to art school. You know, it was kind of like, yeah, I know I didn't go to art school in Paris, but you have that feeling of you're 18 and you're just kind of getting out there and you want to create, you want to meet other people and you're going to work together and not in the same style, but there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm. But also, I suppose you have an aesthetic capability. If that's the right thing, you can look at paintings and think about, even though you don't paint like him at all, you don't produce work like that, you can actually look at it and think in those terms. Yeah.
How long did it take you to write it?
It was 4 years while I was doing other things, but it was a fairly, you can tell by the weight, it was a very substantial piece of work to do. Yeah.
When do you write?
I write when I have to write, by which I mean I do tons of research. And then I get to the point where I'm walking the dog and it's like a freight train of narrative going through your head.
Mm-hmm.
It's just roaring away and you're like, I gotta put this down on paper now. I mean, I've got to this critical mass. The other thing I do a lot of is what I call stress testing. You know, when you've done enough research, you wanna say, well, how much do I really know now? What can I say based, so you really just start, okay, I'm gonna write this scenario. I'm gonna start typing on my laptop, you know, this part of this whatever, and then that's when you start noticing, I don't know that, I don't know where he was that day, who's this guy over here?
Yeah.
And that's the stress testing is all about. So it's not a well, I'm gonna write on Saturday morning, or I'm gonna, you know, there's always sometimes it's, you know, you stop, you do a bit of research, and then you go right back in and revise, but.
The name of our program is A Day in the Life.
Yeah.
What's a day in your life like when you're researching and writing?
Well, I think every day, now that I'm old and feeble, I get up at 8 in the morning. And I always get up at 8 in the morning. I don't know what a weekend is. It's partly being self-employed. There is no weekdays. So yeah, 8 in the morning, have a coffee, have a light breakfast. I got a laptop. I have subscriptions to, let's see, Toronto Star, New York Times, La Presse in Montreal, and The Guardian in England. And I'll go through the basic stuff of that. And then I go to the New York Times and I do the crossword and I do the spelling bee. And that wakes my brain up as much as it's going to be woken. And then by 9-ish, the dogs probably want to go out somewhere. And then I just pick up whatever I need to do that, you know, if this is well, I got some tapes to transcribe. There's a project right now where it's basically a lot of, you know, interviews. I got to get this 3-hour interview done. I'm going to do that today. Or you pick what you're going to do. And then, as I said, if you've been working on your own, you don't have a regular schedule. You go get groceries on Thursday afternoon and you work on Saturday, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I don't do a 9 to 5. Maybe I'll have a nap at 3 and then I'll do some readings in the evening. It's pretty flexible.
Can you describe your emotional relationship with the project as it evolves?
Cold and cruel. That's the project. No, I mean, you want to stay excited by it. You want to feel like you're always moving ahead. You kind of
Ever get disappointed? Do you ever get disillusioned?
No, I'm too old and done this enough that I don't think I'm not going to be able to pull it off.
Yeah.
You know, there are moments where you worry that I got way too much stuff. What am I going to do? In fact, even this book, the length it is, I probably took almost 100 pages out of the first part of its life,
Wow.
you know, before I got to a final draft. So,
Now, I want to dig into the book a little bit.
okay.
And I want to begin by saying when you kindly gave me the very recently published book, I looked at the title of it, and you made reference to this, and I said, wait a minute, Jackson couldn't have been in both world wars.
Right.
Tell us what the title of the book means.
Well, yeah, he fought a lot of wars. You know, he was literally in a war. He was in the First World War as a soldier in the 60th Battalion, an infantryman. But before he got to the war, he was fighting a whole bunch of other wars on the art front. He was a pretty opinionated guy who wrote letters to the editor and wrote letters to the head of the National Gallery, and he never held back on what he thought about what was dumb and stupid and ignorant. And he fought with critics. He sometimes fought with, you know, fellow artists. So Jackson was a fairly combative guy, and a lot of that fight was, he fought with, the collecting class that in Montreal, tons of money, nobody bought domestic art. So he had a lot of fronts he was, keeping under active fire, and then a real war came along.
You write that as difficult as art was as a career choice in Canada at the turn of the 20th century, Jackson was wont to overstate the obstacles and hostilities in his recollections. When he wrote about events, were they not reflective of the events about which he was writing?
Yeah, he tended to tweak things a bit. He tended to make things a little worse than they were. He would write things in his memoir about, we had this exhibition and there wasn't a line in the press, and then you kind of go back and, well, I'm going to go look at La Presse, I'm going to look at the Gazette, and the Montreal Star, and, well, there's reviews, and some of them are pretty good. So, yeah, I mean, it was not an easy way to make it go. He really didn't sell very much, and it really was very frustrating. But you cannot take Jackson at his word. Plus, he loved a good story. So, and stories always need heroes and villains, and as time went on, his villains got a little more, two-dimensional, I think, in his recollections.
Want to talk about the impact of World War I, and you've already touched on this a bit, but in the book you write, if you want to understand the formation of the Group of Seven, you need to understand how the members of that group experienced and responded to the war. Yeah. You've told us about incidents in the lives of each of them, injuries, emotional breakdown. Right. How did they respond to the war? Because that's the word you use. Yeah, well,
Lismer did some very good war art himself at the end of the war in Halifax, where he was teaching. I think J. McDonald, although not being in the war, did a lot of war propaganda work, but it was a period where he was really being changed by his relationship with Tom Thomson. The two of them kind of fed off each other, and J.H. McDonald was already a very gifted artist, but I think the presence of Thomson pushed him a little further than he would have had he not been around him at that time. Harris is a little more different. Harris, it just about destroyed him because of his brother's loss. He had to recover from that. Yeah. So they all, and then Jackson had the most, Frederick Varley, I think Frederick Varley became the painter he was capable of becoming. Mm-hmm. He had a lot of potential, but really hadn't come yet. It was surprising they picked him as a war artist and sent him over in 1918. But, Jackson thought he was the one. There were 4 people sent over. This was after Jackson, who has been in the Army. There were 4 Canadians that were sent over, and he thought he's the one that can do a big composition. And even though Varley and Jackson really didn't get along before, they were pretty wary of each other. But it took, by the time Varley gets to London in the spring of 1918, he's found a different Jackson when he gets there. He really does recognize that, writes his wife about it, and they start to kind of bond as people. Mm-hmm. And Varley's war art was pretty amazing stuff. It really, I think, pushed him forward as a serious artist.
Douglas, I want to invite our audience to think back to that picture, that stark landscape. Yeah. And you wrote, Jackson was able to create small masterpieces when he realized that his canvases should not be about the war, but about the effects of the war on the landscape.
Yeah, the whole war art program had a real conundrum as, well, what are you going to do with the war? Because everybody seemed to agree, when some were produced, that the old war paintings, the Charge of the Light Brigade kind of heroics things, that's dead and gone. This is a mechanized, alienating, horrifying, landscape and experience. And even though some of those paintings were still what Jackson called the cook-ups, they were still being done, but he didn't think he was capable of doing them. And so, well, if you're not doing that, what are you doing? How are you going to show the war? And for him, that was a real dilemma, partly because I think just the sheer trauma of going back to the front and having to look at it again. Not wanting to paint blood and guts, as he said. Yeah. He didn't want to do the literally visceral stuff that really Varley started to do. And he really hit upon the idea that, well, if you show what war does to the landscape, even though you might not see people in them necessarily, you've portrayed war, you've shown the process. And a lot of Jackson's best paintings, I finally came to realize that partly it was because the reality of he had to be back from the front a little bit. But a lot of his best war paintings, the war, everything is kind of wiped out in the foreground and there's nothing going on, but the background, on the horizon, the war is still going. It's churning away, this machine. It's, it's this active, activity of destruction. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the weather and the shelling, but he's very good at giving you that sense of this foreground and when this is over, but it's still going on over there in a way that's, that's quite, it's one of his best ones. It's almost like a Georgian Bay squall.
Yeah.
Just bluish purple, up on the horizon, that lens.
Yeah.
So.
The Group of Seven have achieved a position in the minds of Canadians and their place in Canadian art that wasn't always there. You write, there was far from broad acceptance that Canada needed this new school of landscape painting as its dominant, defining artistic movement. One of the things about the book that I found intriguing was that the Group of Seven were not widely accepted in the early days. And in fact, some critics said that the group's work portrayed Canada as a backwater of civilization.
Yeah, it was a pervasive criticism, and I think one of the interesting things I found is that up to about 1912-13, when there was an urge to get a new Canadian landscape, there was always an urge to do a new Canadian landscape, but the idea coming out of Toronto was that it needed to show the energy of the country. It was the buildings, and it was the the railways being built, and some of Harris did some very interesting early cityscape stuff, worker housing things. J.H. MacDonald did Tracks and Traffic, which was a great winter painting of a train chugging through down Toronto. But they gave that all up fundamentally, and after seeing Scandinavian art in a big exhibition in Buffalo in that winter, they seized upon a very Nordic idea of this sparseness power of the landscape was going to represent basically the soul of the country. So a lot of the blowback was that, well, that's not what Canada is. Canada is Toronto and all these factories, and it's all these railways, and there was definitely an anti-modern, without getting into all the academia of it, this idea of rejecting and nostalgia for what had been lost, and Jackson was very much an anti-modernist that way. He really didn't like the modern world on the canvas.
You wrote that Jackson lamented the disappearance of traditional building forms and ethnic dress.
Yeah.
And the intrusion of internal combustion engines into rural life and even the skies.
Yeah, it's an interesting contradiction, because one of the things I enjoyed was that in his early work in Europe from 1909 to 12, he's watching airplanes. He's writing about them in letters home. I mean, it's really new. I mean, Blériot does his crossing of the English Channel right around when he's painting, right by there. But he's fretting about, one letter home. He says, we get all these dirigibles and planes up there. They're going to fling the clouds around like so much custard. Like, what's going to happen to what we're looking at? And he hated gasoline engines on farms. He hated farm plans that came from American magazines. He wasn't alone in being like that, but he really had a resistance to, change, which was a reality around him. He didn't want to show it. He didn't want to look at it.
He also was anti-materialistic. And you quote him, you quote him referring to the disgusting materialism of the Americans and their responsibility for most of the bad qualities of Canadians.
Yeah, he was in an anti-modern way. He was a classic anti-materialist, and I think he was legitimate that way. He just wanted to make enough to make a living. He really had no grand aspirations to be on that. Thompson was almost more that way, and a lot of it comes out of other readings that would have come from J.H. MacDonald. But he even thought the war was going to be the end of materialism.
Yeah.
I never understood, honestly, I should even admit that, but why he thought defeating Germany, on behalf of the British Empire, was going to end commercialism and materialism in their lives. That was what he wrote the day after the war ended. Well, that's all over now.
Yeah.
Really? How did you think that's going to stop it? It's going to get worse. If that's worse, it did.
I want to spend a moment on the focus that you give southern Georgian Bay, obviously,
Yeah.
because Jackson did.
Yeah,
And of course, many of us know the areas
Right.
where he painted and
Right.
some of the buildings in which he painted. even.
right.
So I'll just commend our audience to look up words
Right.
in the index like Franceville and
Right.
see how often
Right.
there's reference to
Yeah.
to our area. What was the importance of Southern Georgian Bay to Jackson in his work?
Well, if Jackson, I think the fact that Jackson came here is supposed to be the start of, this movement, this very protean movement, recognizing the Northland, as they tended to call it, that there was something new here to paint. And he came here completely by accident. He'd gone to Berlin, or what became Kitchener, to see some fairly wealthy relatives and maybe find a patron. This was in 1910, and that went nowhere. But one of the families related to the Clement family had a cottage up in the Cognition, so it was, well, why don't you come up with us for our holidays? And so he came up for the first time in 1910. And as he said, I had never heard of Georgian Bay. He was from Montreal and then was painting in Europe all the time. And I think what's amazing about that summer is he writes a letter to his mother, and I'm paraphrasing it, but he's basically saying, well, I'm chopping wood because there's nothing to do. There's just no sketching. It's all just thin, basically like scrubby trees and bare rock. It's kind of nice for a holiday, but there's nothing here to paint. And for anybody that knew, or we realize now, that Jackson really created or helped create that whole, aesthetic of the North, representing what Canada is. His first view of it, he has no idea what to do with it. He just doesn't see what to paint. And as he will admit, by 1913, he'd come back briefly once in 1911, but by 1913, he was starting to figure it out. He's like, okay, I can see what I can work with here. I can see what I can do. But it also tells you there was definitely an aesthetic from the cottager side he was saying with. They weren't, it's a reminder to ourselves that what we think is naturally appealing is actually something a bit acquired. That we think of all the bare rocks and the thunderstorms and the wind-blown trees. Cottagers hated that stuff. I mean, they came up, they built their cottages on the lee side of the island, facing the mainland. They didn't want to look at Georgian Bay. They didn't want to look at all the bad weather. They wanted a nice, quiet place to go swimming and, paddle a canoe. So you had to create that aesthetic. You had to have a public respond to it, and you had to have artists respond to it. I think people like J.H. MacDonald, when he first came up, I think he got it right away. He figured it out pretty quickly. But Jackson, it was a struggle. He didn't know what to do. He really didn't know what to do.
I want to touch on a few of Jackson's attitudes
Yes.
that you cover. Politically, you say he was a self-declared social democrat by 1916.
Yes, in a letter to his sister, he makes it clear. That's when he was just going into combat. So definitely a left-of-center guy, anti-materialist, constantly railing against anti-capitalism, against capitalism.
Right.
Not like right over into full socialism, but he was very much left-of-center by that point.
His comments about Thompson are interesting. All of his compliments seem to be veiled in some way. He says, you need a man with you who tries to do the impossible.
Yeah.
What more glowing comment could he make than that? But he follows it up by saying that Thompson was never a member of the Group of Seven. His untimely death prevented that. Yet his contributions to the movement that eventually found expression in the group cannot be measured. Was there some jealousy there?
No, I think he really struggled with what do you do with Thompson as a legacy. It was devastating when he was killed, when he found out that Thompson had died. And the struggle they had after the group came along was, well, what do you do with Thompson? Is he the member that wasn't? Is he the start of the movement? And the biggest thing he had to respond to really was that, no, we didn't, like Thompson didn't start this thing and we all imitated him. He actually was learning from us without denigrating the fact that they were also learning from him. Thompson goes through an absolutely astonishing arc of progress as an artist, especially from about 1914 on, because Jackson first met him just before that and then shared a studio with him. And then his first chance to paint him was in Algonquin Park in fall of 1914, when the war had just started, and he wanted to get out into the woods and paint with this guy and have some time with him. And I think the most interesting thing to me about him and Thompson was that when Jackson was the only member of the group, the formative proto-group that actually enlisted. I mean, his good friend, the artist Randolph Houghton, enlisted first. His younger brother enlisted. He felt tremendous pressure to get in this thing. The other ones that didn't join, they were like married, they had kids. Thompson was single, was fit, any education. I think the indications from Varley and Jackson was that he was probably a conscientious objector at the start of the war, how he stayed whether he stayed the whole way through. But there's a really telling letter that Jackson writes when he's in the army and he's in camp in England, training before they go to France, and he's writing, I can't remember who it was, it might have been MacDonald, and he says, say hello to Harris and Lismer, I think. Doesn't say hello to Thompson.
Yeah.
And I think that gap was an enormous oversight, deliberate oversight, that I'm here, I'm about to go into combat. He's in Algonquin Park with a new silk tent, painting his brains out and, living the life Thompson wanted to live. But the moment he learns that he's dead is an absolute catastrophic realization to him. Any resentment he might have had about being here and Thompson not being there was gone. It was a horrendous loss to the guy.
You referred to racism.
Yeah.
And you do deal with that in the book. You treat it delicately, but there is reference to the ignoring of indigenous realities in the Group of Seven work.
Well, I think we start more with the fact that when you start to read Jackson's letters as a young man, when he's away in Chicago in his early 20s and going to school there, he's writing his mother home in Westmount, a very, Anglo enclave of a city that's steeped in eugenicist ideas of fittest. He's horrendously judgmental of Jews, Catholics, Irish. I mean, it's hair-raising. And I think the anti-Semitism is pretty much gone in another year or so. He did not have good things to say about black people right into the First World War. Whether he got over that, I don't know enough about his later letters. He was like, his attitudes to Canadian Germans were off the scale. By the time he gets to combat and people are dying, I mean, he basically wants anybody of German descent out of the country. And he has German relatives. I mean, he's really effectively saying, get Uncle so-and-so out of here. We don't need his kind in our country. He comes out of that war broken, chastised. He talks about art being for all creeds and all classes. The thing with the people who always struggle with the group is that it was portrayed at the time. Nations and race were interchangeable, or it's the same thing. So you get the critical, positive write-ups that this is like a racial experience and view of the land. And so that's when you start to worry about issues of erasure. Like, what are you not showing? Or what are you implying is not even there and has never been there? But now that we're in the country and we're now portraying it, we're making this the soul of us, which is basically a bunch of white people that just came from England. So that's the issue with.
A journalist who championed the group stated that the art of the group, and I quote, expressed a particular nationalism in a way that could be read only as a subset of whiteness.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty strong.
Yeah.
You've alluded to friction among the members of the group.
Yeah.
Were there other frictions that didn't involve Jackson?
Oh, I think Varley got fights with everybody. I mean, there's a great line from, I think, Marilyn Tippett, his blogger, who said, that Varley basically had a habit of, fighting with people who disagreed with him, but also with people who did him a favor. I mean, he was pretty mercurial. So he's one of the most interesting characters to me in that arc of Jackson's life. You can clearly tell that when they're together for the first and only time in Algonquin Park in the fall of 1914 and Varley's there, you can tell from Jackson's letters that Varley is just really annoying him. Yeah. Like, he just doesn't belong here. He doesn't get what we're doing. And it takes the war for them to start understanding each other.
I also, just for fun, will reflect on the fact that among the books that you chose for us to speak about, you didn't mention the masterpiece to which I made a contribution about cottage ownership.
That was a bizarre project I've just about buried for psychiatric reasons. It was, that was a commission project that came after I did won the National Business Book Award. And until I got into it, I didn't really realize they wanted something that would cover all properties in North America of any kind. And I had to learn the US tax code to be able to write. It was just a frightening amount of research to cover the bases of, what had seemed like. So yeah, it's out there somewhere, but I don't talk about it.
No, I understand. Well, I have really enjoyed this.
Yeah.
And
as
really
always, as you
enjoyed
said,
the
it
book.
went by fast.
Yeah. So let me just thank
My
you
disc
both.
defense was faster
That's true.
and friendlier.
Well, I want to thank some folks, and then
Yeah.
I'll come back and thank you. So we want to thank Rogers Community Television and Madison Fitzpatrick, who is our producer, although we have another producer doing the program this evening. Really want to thank the folks here at the MCC for making this program possible. They're very supportive of our efforts, and I want to thank my friend Glenn Irwin, who is our technician and who keeps things humming along here. Thanks again to our season sponsors, Kathy Bales, Michelle Dishaw, Jeff Holloway, Janet Walter of RBC Dominion Securities. We sincerely appreciate your support. Alex, I hope that maybe some of this was interesting to you from an art point of view. Maybe you can start a new group of 7. Thanks to you, Alexander McLaughlin, Art by Alex. I want to thank our Day in the Life team, John Farragher, Brian McKell, Lorianne Clancy, Jen Parker, Doris Sloan, Jonathan Wallace, Dan Broom, and Michelle Thibodeau. Those are the people who meet with me the morning after the show and tell me everything I did wrong. So thanks to them. Certainly do a great job of keeping me humble. Our next program, I think is going to be very popular. My guest will be Marie Henein, who you probably know as arguably the leading Canadian criminal lawyer. She worked for 10 years with Eddie Greenspan, who was a guest on this program, and defended, among other people, Guillaume Ghomeshi. Many of you will recognize that name. And I can tell you that it went on sale this morning, and the ticket sales in the first 2 hours were remarkable. So if you're at all interested in a person that I think is one of the most fascinating people in Canada today, please join us on June 28th for Marie Henein. Thank you to the live audience. Douglas and I will meet you in the atrium after the program, and the book is being sold here. So if you're interested, it's a great read. Please do that. Douglas, thanks to you. I have really enjoyed this, and I have learned a lot from you. So thanks for that.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
Think it's okay to drive high? Think again. Drug-impaired driving is as illegal as drunk driving, and in Ontario, the penalties are the same. If police suspect you're driving under the influence of drugs of any kind, or a combination of drugs and alcohol, and you fail a roadside test, your license will be suspended immediately for up to 30 days. You'll pay a penalty of $198, and you can be charged